1,000,000 Standoff. Prologue. Early in July 1998, John Vukovic decided to make an active submission to the West Australian Forest Regional Agreement before the closing date on the 31st. He informed Peter Murphy that he intended to lock on to a woodchip train at the Wesfarmers Bunnings woodchip rail terminal in Bunbury. Pete offered to assist. Early one morning they went down to wait for a train. They waited and waited, but no train came. It had been a pleasant sunny winter day, but they were dissatisfied. Pete made some inquiries and learnt that the woodchip terminal was chock-a-block full of old-growth forest chips, and no more trains were coming until a ship came to load from the stockpile. John learnt that a ship was due at 9 p.m. on the 26th. He decided to try to prevent the ship from docking. He got hold of a plywood dinghy and, with Pete, took it down to Bunbury Inner Harbour to check out the woodchip wharf. While rowing out, it was noticed that regular bailing was required to keep afloat, but they thought that they arrived at the wharf unnoticed. They agreed that if one was chained to number 3 buffer while sitting in the dinghy, the ship might be prevented from docking. The dinghy weighed 40 kilograms, and the ship was registered at 40,000 tonnes, so there was an auspicious ratio of 1,000,000 to 1. While rowing back, with the leaks getting ahead of the bailing, Pete suggested that if the leaks were patched, the operation would be enhanced. John agreed and volunteered to get some sealant and some high tensile chain and a padlock. Some hurricane lamps were also acquired, but thankfully became superfluous when the ship's arrival time was altered to 3 p.m. By the day of the ship's arrival, John had smeared sealant over the more obvious leaks in the dinghy, and Pete had rounded up a couple of canoes and a crew of forest activists. Fierce storms on the 24th and 25th had cleared to occasional showers on the big day, when the crew met at John's place and piled gear onto a borrowed truck. John promptly used the truck to ram an innocent car parked on the other side of the road, which he hadn't noticed as he backed the truck out of the driveway. After details were exchanged with the surprisingly placid owner of the car, the truck got underway and the whole shebang eventually arrived at the Bunbury Power Station, which is situated across the harbour from the woodchip terminal. After a while the gang was surprised to see the pilot boat come over from the outer harbour and nose up to number 3 buffer before going out to meet the woodchip ship as it approached Bunbury. They guessed that the dinghy had been noticed sniffing around the buffer a couple of days before. With the pilot aboard, the ship slid into the outer harbour and was met by 2 tugboats, which chuffed it into the inner harbour. The dinghy was launched, and John took to the oars while Pete directed from the stern. After a couple of strokes, a rollock broke away from the boat, so they had to take an oar each and paddle. This was slower than rowing, and there was a worry that they wouldn't be fast enough to cross the ship's bow. But they did make it, and had an opportunity to marvel at the size of the bow bulb. While the tugs turned the ship around, the dinghy arrived at the wharf, where the diminutive Bearheart was shouting and waving at the ship to make sure that the dinghy had been noticed. From the dinghy, a banner reading "Rigged Forest Agreement" was strung up on the buffer. Bearheart was told that if the banner wasn't noticed, she wouldn't be either, so she went off to avoid being arrested. Pete threaded the end of the chain through the steelwork supporting the buffer, and John wrapped the chain around his waist and snapped on the padlock. They then awaited events. Meanwhile, PK and Luke had lashed 2 canoes together and mounted a borrowed outboard motor between them to form a stable camera platform. Took it on a sea trial where the motor broke down, and paddles had to be used to avoid being blown to India. During these goings-on, Jess and M had contacted those in authority and the media. One press photographer came down but was denied access to the wharf, so she had to take a long-distance shot, which was published in the Bunbury Herald. TV cameraman came down and he was picked up by the canoes, as well as Sky with her still camera. Showers were imminent, so the dinghy crew donned their waterproofs just as some wag on the wharf turned on the sprinklers used to lubricate the buffer. Pete promptly raised his brolly and started bailing with his free hand. John stood up so that the water running down the train wouldn't go into his nethers. The launch tried to keep the canoes away from the action, but PK deftly avoided it so that the cameraman could interview John. The ship had been turned around and pushed up to the wharf, but the dinghy crew wouldn't budge. With great skill, the ship was positioned so that only its bow half was against the buffers and clear of the dinghy. In that position, the ship could not be tied up, so the tugs had to keep pushing on its side to stop it drifting. Wood chips could not be loaded. Pete and John were damp chilled by the time the police arrived and told John to unchain himself. His hands were cold and stiff from holding the dinghy in position from the bottom of the buffer for over 4 hours. The padlock and chain had slipped down to his groin inside his pants, and he had no intention of putting his freezing hands in the region, so he declined. The cops arranged for a launch to put one of them onto the dinghy to cut the chain with bolt cutters. A brave constable attempted this, nearly capsizing the dinghy in the process, but the high tensile chain was not scratched. Then a welder with a gas-cutting gear was put on aboard the dinghy, and he managed to cut the chain without burning John or anything else. By then John was quite willing to follow the cops from the launch, up the ladder and onto the wharf. Meanwhile, Pete quietly paddled away towards the powerhouse, and by the time the cops thought about arresting him, he was too far away. It was insisted that John remove the remaining chain before he was put into the paddy wagon. The policemen and women were too coy to grope for the padlock, so it took some time for John to insert the key and unlock with still cold hands. The following Wednesday in Bunbury Court, John pleaded not guilty, and bail was continued until a hearing on 2nd December 1998, when he will defend himself. Sky took some great photos, one of which was published in the Bunbury Mail. The others form this background. A portion of the video taken by the TV cameraman Graham Bishop was run on GWN News, and a smaller portion on the ABC News.